In a universe torn apart by endless wars and brutal forces, Dan is just a survivor haunted by a bloody past. He seeks refuge on the icy planet of Corin 6, a place where life seems impossible. But everything changes when he meets Sila, a mysterious alien girl on the run from a brutal system that sees her only as a tool, a possession to be controlled. No one can help her escape, except Dan. As they flee from relentless hunters, a battle rages not just outside but within each of them. They face death, a system bent on imposing control, and the looming threat of being erased from existence. But when the world stands on the brink of collapse, Dan and Sila make a decision to stop running. And then, in a breathless moment, they must choose to run or stand and fight. As the royal forces close in, and survival seems more fragile than ever, they find themselves face to face with the Auto Guardian, an ancient war machine, now the deadliest threat. At this moment, they realize, this is the moment we stand, fight to the end, or we'll be wiped out. The wind howled outside, wild and untamed, like the anguished cries of a beast trapped in the vast expanse of a frozen world. The storm was merciless, blasting snow in all directions, swirling it across the barren, icy plains. The ground was unforgiving, covered in jagged rocks and the shattered remains of forgotten machines. Their once proud forms now half buried under the relentless snow, like forgotten soldiers lost to time. The sky was a deep, cold blue, filled with dense, swirling clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. It was as if the very heavens had conspired against life itself. No stars pierced the storm, no sun ever shone here. Only the bitter, unyielding cold. Inside a small, dimly lit tent, the air was thick with the warmth of a heater fighting against a chill. A human named Dan sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the tent's walls. The heater buzzed softly, but even its heat felt weak in the face of the freezing world outside. His jacket, thick and worn, was patched in several places, its fabric frayed from years of use. His hands, weathered and red from the harsh cold, trembled slightly as he poured hot water into a metal cup. The steam rose, a small comfort in a world that offered little warmth. Dan's face was gaunt, his eyes tired, worn by the weight of too many days spent alone. His thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the past of wars he had fought, of battles he had seen, and of the silence that followed. Silence that had become his only companion in a world that felt like it had forgotten him. Dan, in a low, tired voice. Corin 6. No place for life, but here I am. A scout, a survivor, trying to outrun the ghosts of old wars. He sipped from the cup, the warmth trickling down his throat, but it was fleeting. Nothing could warm the depths of his soul here, on this forsaken planet. The winds outside grew louder, battering the walls of the tent, as though urging him to leave. But he stayed, alone in his corner, with nothing but the hum of the heater and the memory of better days. Suddenly, a sound pierced the air, unlike the wind, a slow, deliberate footstep. Dan froze, his eyes snapping to the flap of the tent. His hand instinctively reached for the pulse pistol lying beside him, cold steel against his skin. His breath caught, heart pounding. At first, he thought it was the storm, playing tricks on his senses, but no, this was different. These steps were heavier, slower, more deliberate. A soft thud echoed, something pressing against the tent wall. Dan's pulse quickened. His fingers curled around the grip of his weapon, and with slow, deliberate movements, he rose to his feet. The tent was small, its cramped space giving him little room to maneuver. Dan, whispering to himself, barely audible. "Who's out there?" No answer. Just the wind. He carefully made his way toward the flap, fingers brushing the cold fabric as he reached for it. He opened it slightly, just enough to peek outside. What he saw stole his breath. A figure fragile, almost delicate, was standing at the edge of the tent. A girl, her skin a pale blue, covered in frost. Her hair was silver, strands frozen into icicles that shimmered like a starry night sky. Her body trembled, her breath shallow, like the wind itself was trying to claim her. She was shivering, her limbs frozen in place as if the cold had already begun to steal her life force. Without a second thought, Dan moved forward, his heart pounding as he reached out and pulled her inside, sealing the flap behind them. She collapsed into his arms, almost weightless, as though the cold had drained her of all strength. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, but her pulse, weak though it was, still beat beneath his fingers. "Dan," whispering, his voice trembling with urgency. "What are you doing here? Who are you?" Her lips were turning purple, her eyes barely open. She tried to speak, but the words came out weak, almost drowned by the sound of the storm outside. "Alien girl," weakly. "You're not like the others." Dan's mind raced, the question lingering in the air. "Others?" he repeated softly, his eyes scanning her face. What had she meant? And why was she here, in the middle of a storm that could kill anyone within minutes? Her body trembled harder as she fainted in his arms. Dan didn't hesitate. He checked her pulse again, relieved to find it faint but steady. He wrapped her tighter in the thermal blanket, cranking up the heat, watching as the life slowly returned to her face. But questions still haunted him. Who was she? What had she run from? And why had she ended up here, in his tent? Hours passed. The heater hummed softly in the corner, a constant reminder of the fragile warmth in a world that wanted nothing more than to consume them both. Dan sat on the ground, his eyes never leaving the alien girl wrapped in the thermal blanket. She lay there, motionless, her skin still cold to the touch, her breath shallow but steady. Every now and then, he checked her pulse, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. It was weak, but it was their life, fragile and precious, clinging to her like a whisper. The storm outside raged on, as if the planet itself was trying to tear everything apart. But here, in this small, fragile shelter, There was an uneasy calm. The world outside seemed so far away, as though it existed only in a dream he was desperate to wake from. Dan blinked, fighting the fatigue creeping into his mind. What is she? He thought to himself, the question hanging like a shadow in his mind. What's her story? Suddenly, a faint, trembling breath. Her eyes fluttered open, a pale violet glow lighting up the dim interior of the tent. Dan froze. He had been waiting for this moment, but he wasn't ready for it. She blinked, her eyes scanning the space around her with confusion, as if waking from a deep, frozen slumber. Her gaze settled on him, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched, thick with something unsaid. Then, she gasped, sitting up suddenly, her movements sharp and jerky. She looked around the tent, her eyes wild, as if she had just realized where she was. She stared at Dan, then at the heater, then back to him. Her breath hitched in her chest. Dan, calm, but with urgency. Easy, you're safe. You're in my tent. No one's out there anymore. But the girl didn't seem to hear him. She tried to speak, but her voice was little more than a weak, hoarse whisper. Alien girl, faintly, eyes full of fear. They'll be looking for me? Dan's heart skipped a beat. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, trying to read the emotions flashing across her face. Dan, quiet, almost a whisper. Who will be looking for you? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she seemed to withdraw into herself, her eyes distant as though the world inside her mind was far darker than anything out here in the storm. Her lips trembled as she spoke again. Alien girl, her voice barely a breath. I can't say. If you know, they'll hurt you too. Dan clenched his jaw. Hurt me too. The words echoed in his head. Who could she be running from? And why was she so terrified of being found? Her body shook, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something to anchor her in this new, strange place. But all she found were the small comforts Dan had set up: his fire, the blankets, the warmth. Nothing here could change the fear that haunted her. Dan, leaning forward, more gentle this time. You almost died out there. You need to trust me. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze uncertain. Yet there was something in it, a flicker of something he couldn't name. Trust? Desperation? Maybe both. Finally, she spoke again, her voice shaking with the weight of her secret. Alien girl, whispering, barely audible. I escaped from a ship. I wasn't supposed to survive. I was supposed to be delivered. Dan's chest tightened at the word delivered. His mind raced, connecting the dots. Someone had been trying to control her. She wasn't just a casualty of this world. She had been marked for something far darker. Dan, softly, almost to himself. Delivered, to who? The girl's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it was as if she could see inside him. Something passed between them in that instant, a quiet understanding of their shared isolation. She spoke once more, her voice steadying. "Alien girl," firm, but still trembling. "To someone who thinks owning people is tradition." The word owning hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Dan's hands clenched into fists. He had fought in a war because of that word. He had seen what happens when people think they have the right to own others, to control them. The girl pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking into it as if it could protect her from the weight of her words. Dan, gritting his teeth, his voice low but determined. "And you ran?" She nodded weakly, her lips barely parting. "Alien girl. I had to. I didn't know where to go. But I knew one thing, the signal from you, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt different. Kind." Dan was taken aback. Kind? He hadn't thought of himself as kind, just tired. But he didn't correct her. Instead, he asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Dan, what's your name?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the ground before she answered. "Alien girl," softly, almost as if giving up a part of herself. "Sila." The storm outside showed no signs of slowing. The howling wind seemed to reach inside the tent, clawing at the thin walls with sharp, icy fingers. But inside, a strange calm had settled over Dan and Sila. The heater hummed quietly in the corner, its warmth a fragile barrier against the cold that threatened to reclaim them. Sila sat near the heater, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her eyes distant, yet alert. Her hands trembled as she held the metal cup of warm water, her fingers barely able to grip the cup without shaking. Despite the warmth inside the tent, her body remained tense, as though every fiber of her being was expecting the next wave of danger. Dan sat across from her, his eyes scanning the entrance flap and then the horizon outside, as if the storm itself might be watching them. His mind raced, but the silence between them felt heavy, full of unspoken questions, of understanding, of shared fear. Sila, breaking the silence, her voice low. "They'll keep looking for me. They won't stop. They never stop." Her voice was thick with a weight of knowledge that came from being hunted, being a target for forces beyond her control. Dan didn't need to ask who they were, the fear in her eyes was enough. Dan didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, his mind slowly processing what he had heard. A princess, someone who had been bred for power, for politics. And now she was running. Running from the very people who had created her, controlled her, owned her. Dan, gently, trying to offer reassurance. "Who are they?" "The ones chasing you." Sila lowered her gaze, not able to meet his eyes. Her voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the storm. "Sila. My people, the royal bloodlines. They call it tradition. I was never meant to live. I was meant to be a tool. A way to keep the power inside families. Dan's heart twisted. He knew all too well what it was like to be a pawn in someone else's game, to have your life dictated by others' expectations. But this was something far darker. A life where freedom didn't exist, where choices were forbidden. Dan, his voice sharp, filled with disgust. To them, you're nothing but an object, a possession. Sila nodded silently, her hands still trembling as she held the cup close to her chest. Her mind seemed lost in the past, her thoughts far away from this cold tent, this fleeting moment of safety. Sila, her voice barely a whisper. They wanted to force me, to bind me to someone. Not for love. Not for choice. But to keep their bloodline pure. To keep power in the hands of the few. Dan's jaw clenched. He had heard of such things before, wars fought over power, over blood, over control. But hearing it from her, seeing the pain it caused her, made it all the more real. The idea that someone could be treated like a commodity, a thing to be traded, it was too much. Dan, his voice quiet, determined. You're not just a piece in their game. You're a person. You have the right to choose who you want to be. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. There was a softness in her gaze, a flicker of trust, of relief. She had been running for so long, and now, here she was, with someone who didn't see her as a prize or a possession. Just as a person. Sila, hesitating, then speaking with a quiet urgency. You don't understand. If they find me, if they catch me, they'll make you a target too. They'll hunt you down just for helping me. Dan stood up, walking over to the entrance of the tent and looking outside, his gaze fixed on the swirling storm. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the decision resting on him. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. Dan, without turning to her. I've been running for too long, Sila. Running from my past, from the things I did, the things I failed to stop. But I'm done running. He turned back to face her, his eyes full of resolve. Dan, slowly. I'm with you. And we're going to stop running. We're going to face whatever's coming, together. There was a long silence. It was as if the very air in the tent thickened with the weight of their shared understanding. Sila's face softened, her eyes glimmering with something deeper than gratitude, perhaps something more akin to hope. For the first time since Dan had met her, she didn't seem like a girl on the edge of despair. She seemed ready. Ready to stand, ready to choose. Sila, softly, her voice filled with something new, trust. Where do we go now? Dan reached for his gear, his rifle, and his small pack. He was ready. He was done with the cold, the storms, and the fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dan, determined. We move at first light. North side. I have a signal beacon there, hidden and encrypted. It might not bring help, but it'll bring us options. Sila nodded. She crawled under the blankets again, her body still trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from memories. But she wasn't alone anymore. She was with someone who chose to fight, someone who believed in more than just survival. Sila, quietly, as she closed her eyes. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Dan smiled softly, the first smile that felt genuine in a long time. "Dan, should I be?" She smiled back, though it was small, fleeting. But it was real. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like they might just have a chance. The wind outside was no longer a simple storm. It had grown into something alive, a force that seemed to lash out at the earth in anger, tearing at the snow and ice as if the very planet itself was in rebellion. Dan stood near the flap of the tent, his hand resting lightly on the control panel. His eyes, cold and focused, scanned the horizon through the small opening, watching as the snow swirled in chaotic spirals. Dan's voice over, low, tense. "They are out there. I can feel them. The calm before the storm, but the storm's not here yet. Not in full force." His breath misted in the air as he exhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready. His hand hovered near his rifle. He hadn't wanted to use it, but he knew, deep down, that there was no other choice. Sila was sitting near the heater again, her eyes locked on the ground, lost in thought. Her hands still trembled, though not from the cold anymore. It was the memory of what she had escaped, of the people who had tried to own her, to control her. Dan's voice, to Sila, calm but urgent. "We're not safe here for long. They'll be coming for us." She didn't look up at him, but he could see her eyes widen slightly, her hands clutching the cup tighter as if holding on to something real, something that wasn't made of snow and ice. "Sila," her voice low, trembling. "I told you, they'll come for me, for us. The royal hunters are relentless. They never stop." Dan's brow furrowed, the words sinking into him like cold steel. The royal hunters? He had heard whispers of such groups, merciless, deadly, loyal only to the crown. They hunted without mercy, without remorse, and they didn't care who or what they destroyed along the way. Suddenly, the scanner beeped. The signal was faint, but it was there. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a random ship. This was the unmistakable signature of something larger, something more dangerous. Dan's voice, low, nearly a growl. "They've found us. They're close." Sila, her voice shaking with fear, but also determination. "We don't have much time. They'll tear this place apart looking for us." Dan turned to her, his eyes narrowing as he mentally prepared himself for what was coming. "Dan," softly, with resolve. "Then we leave before they get here?" Without another word, He moved quickly to gather his things: rifle, emergency packs, and the encrypted beacon he had hidden earlier. He threw the pack over his shoulder and turned back to Sila. "Dan, we're moving. Now." But before they could even move toward the exit, a loud, hollow thump echoed outside the tent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. No, this was something else, something solid, something with purpose. Footsteps. Slow and methodical, as if the creatures outside had all the time in the world. Dan's voice, whispering, intense. "Stay down." He moved swiftly, silently, to the back of the tent, his body tense, every nerve screaming at him to be ready. Sila's eyes met his, wide with fear, but there was no time for more words. She nodded, pulling the blanket over her as she crouched low. Outside, the shadows of 4 figures emerged from the swirling storm. Tall, armored, and utterly alien in their appearance, half human, half machine. The royal hunters. They stood like towering statues, scanning the area with cold, glowing sticks that seemed to pierce the darkness. Their movements were calculated, precise. Every step was methodical. They were here for a reason. They were here for her. Dan's voice, low, almost to himself. "God help us." The hunter's glowing eyes scanned the surroundings, picking up traces of heat in the snow. One of them knelt, its hand moving through the freshly fallen snow, as if it could smell their presence. The air felt thick, almost electric. Dan's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The hunters moved closer to the tent, the sound of their boots crunching the snow sending tremors through Dan's spine. He could hear their voices, low and mechanical, talking to each other in a language he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, calculating. Dan, whispering to himself, eyes darting toward Sila. "They are coming. They'll find us if we don't act fast." He grabbed a thermal decoy, placing it carefully on the ground outside the tent. He rolled it out slowly, setting it up just right. It wasn't much, but it would buy them time. Sila's eyes locked on him, her breathing steady but shallow. She knew what was happening, and she trusted him, trusted that they had a chance. A small chance. The tent flap opened slightly, the thermal decoy rolling outside into the snow. The hunters rushed toward it, weapons ready, ice cold and unfeeling. They reached the decoy, their metal hands grabbing at the empty coat. But by then, Dan and Sila were already moving. Dan, to Sila, with finality. "Let's go." They darted into the storm, their footprints quickly disappearing into the thick, swirling snow. The wind howled around them, deafening in its fury, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Behind them, the hunters were already moving in the same direction, following the trail with cold precision. The storm raged, but they kept running, their hearts beating louder than the wind, their only thought, survive. The storm outside had become an all-encompassing force, swirling the snow in a blinding fury. The air was bitter, every breath Dan took sharp in his lungs, the cold creeping into his bones like an old enemy that had never truly gone away. But now, the cold wasn't their biggest problem. It wasn't the storm. It was the hunters. And they were closing in. Dan and Sila moved as one, their bodies pushed to the limits of exhaustion. The crunch of their boots in the snow was swallowed by the wind, but the sound of engines far behind them cut through the chaos. The hunters were on them. They wouldn't stop until they found them. Dan, his voice steady but urgent. Keep moving. We're not far from the ridge. Sila stumbled slightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she didn't slow down. The snow was deep, each step harder than the last. The wind hit them like a wall, but they pressed on, their path already covered by the storm. Dan, to himself, thinking, the ridge isn't far. We just have to get there, then we can disappear into the old mines. They'll never find us if we make it. Behind them, the sounds of the hunters' engines grew louder. The snow machines were fast, almost too fast for Dan and Sila to outrun, but Dan knew the land. He knew how to disappear into the ice. Sila's eyes were wild, darting around in every direction as if she could feel the eyes of the hunters on them. She was afraid, but not of the cold. It was the people who hunted her, the people who had been chasing her for her entire life. Sila, her voice shaky, but still determined. They won't stop until they catch me. Dan, without looking back, his voice low and unwavering. I know. But they will stop. They have to. He didn't say more. They couldn't afford to. The wind picked up again, howling louder, pushing them forward. The ground beneath them began to shift, the snowy expanse turning into a field of frozen metal debris, remnants of a long-forgotten war. The ashlands. Dan, his voice soft, almost as if to himself. Fusion bombs. From the old war. Nothing lived here after that. The terrain was treacherous, and the air was thick with a bitter taste of history. The broken remains of machines, melted and twisted from the nuclear fallout, jutted out from the ground like the bones of a dead giant. The wind blew through the twisted wreckage, sending ghostly echoes through the hollow space. Sila looked around, her gaze shifting from the wreckage to Dan. Sila, with a quiet, almost sorrowful tone. What happened here? Dan, his eyes scanning the landscape, focused. A battlefield. A war fought over power, over control. And nothing survived. Nothing except the machines, and memories. Sila nodded, her hand clutching her thermal blanket tighter around her. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the decaying remnants of the past. The ghostly silence of the ashlands seemed to press down on her, reminding her of the things she had tried to escape. But there was no time to dwell. The sound of engines of hunters was too close now. They had to keep moving. Dan, glancing over at her, speaking with finality. We don't stop here. We move, now. Fast. They pushed on, each step a fight against the elements, against the ghosts of the past that loomed over them like a shadow. The wind had grown louder, the snow falling in sheets that seemed to obscure their vision, making the world feel even more hostile and distant. Sila's breath came in short bursts, her face streaked with frost, but she didn't stop. The cold had nothing on the fear that had chased her for so long, and she was not going to let it catch her now. Behind them, the sound of the engines grew louder, closer. The hunters weren't far. The adrenaline surged in Dan's veins, urging him to push harder, faster. He could see the North Ridge in the distance just a few more kilometers, but it might as well have been a lifetime. They reached the edge of the ashlands, and the snow turned lighter, the ground slightly more stable. The North Ridge was within sight, but so were the hunters. Sila, her voice low, filled with dread. They are getting closer. Dan turned to her, his eyes hard with determination. The ridge was just ahead, but so were their pursuers. They had seconds. Dan, gripping her arm and pulling her along. Keep moving. We can't let them catch us. The ground beneath them shifted again, but this time, it wasn't the snow. There was something else. Something darker, something mechanical. The echo of heavy footsteps vibrated through the ground, another threat. Out of the corner of his eye, Dan saw the shape of something moving through the storm. A silhouette. Something large. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. Sila, whispering, her voice filled with realization. What is that? Dan, eyes wide with dread. An Autoguardian. A relic of the old war. But why is it here? They shouldn't have activated it. The towering machine rose from the ground, half buried in ice, half formed from ancient technology. Its eyes lit up with a blood-red glow, scanning the terrain, its gears grinding against the frozen earth. It was a guardian built to protect, built to defend, but now, all it knew was violence. Sila gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what it was. The Autoguardian's sensors locked onto them, its massive frame moving with terrifying precision. Dan, under his breath, eyes flicking between the machine and the incoming hunters. Get down. The cold was no longer just cold, it was pain. The wind sliced through their clothes, tearing at their skin with icy teeth. Each breath felt like a battle, each step a struggle to stay upright in the deep, unforgiving snow. The wind howled around them, pushing them forward, but in a way that only seemed to drive them deeper into the jaws of the storm. Dan and Sila had barely made it to the ridge, their bodies exhausted, their minds clouded by fear and fatigue. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to. The Autoguardian was closed now, its massive, mechanical frame grinding against the earth as it moved through the snow. It was relentless, its red eyes scanning the ground like a predator on the hunt. The ground trembled beneath their feet as it came closer, its heavy steps echoing like the sound of death itself. Dan, gritting his teeth, voice low. We can't outrun it. It'll catch us. Sila, panting, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. What do we do now? Dan didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned their surroundings, searching for any kind of escape, any kind of advantage. But the landscape was as empty and barren as it had been for miles. There was no hiding here. No safe place to run. The machine was drawing nearer, its shadow looming large over them, blocking out the little light that filtered through the storm. Dan knew they were running out of time. They had to make a decision, and fast. Dan, speaking with urgency. We're going to have to fight it. Sila's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. She had been running for so long, and the thought of standing and fighting was almost alien to her. She had spent her life trying to survive, not fight. But now, standing on the edge of the frozen world, with the terrifying Auto-Guardian closing in, she realized that this might be her only chance to truly live. Sila, her voice trembling but steadying. You think we can stop it? Dan didn't answer. His mind raced, quickly calculating their options. He grabbed his rifle, checking the charge. It wouldn't be enough to take down the Auto-Guardian, nothing would, but it might be enough to slow it down. Dan, quietly, his voice filled with resolve. It's not about stopping it. It's about buying us time. We run after this. We can make it to the mines if we're fast enough. Sila looked at him, her face full of uncertainty. But then something shifted in her eyes, a spark of something fierce, something that had been buried deep within her since the moment she ran from the ship. She wasn't going to run anymore. Sila, nodding, her voice steady now. Then let's make it count. Dan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a small explosive device from his pack and attached it to the side of a nearby rusted metal structure, a remnant of the old war. The device was crude but effective, enough to cause a distraction and hopefully slow the Auto-Guardian down long enough for them to make their escape. The Auto-Guardian was now only a few hundred feet away, its massive frame moving like a storm on its own. Its sensors blinked, locking onto them. Dan raised his rifle, aiming at the glowing red eyes of the machine, but Sila's hand shot out, stopping him. Sila, quietly, with a pleading tone. No, don't waste a shot. We need that distraction. Dan's eyes met hers. There was no time for hesitation. He nodded sharply, moving back into position. His heart pounded in his chest as he set the explosive, making sure it was perfectly timed. Then, without a word, they both ran. They sprinted toward the edge of the ridge, heading toward the old mining tunnel that Dan had mentioned earlier. Their footsteps were lost in the snow, but the sound of the machine's pursuit was growing louder, like a death sentence echoing behind them. The explosive went off with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave through the snow-covered ground. The blast rocked the earth beneath them, and the sound of the Auto-Guardian's steps faltered for just a moment. But it wasn't enough. The machine was already adjusting, recalculating its target. Dan, breathing heavily, shouting to Sila, "Keep moving. We're almost there." But just as they reached the mouth of the tunnel, a blast of energy shot past them, narrowly missing Dan's shoulder. He ducked instinctively, but the machine wasn't far behind. "Sila," her voice sharp with urgency. "Move, Dan. Move." The tunnel ahead was their only chance, their last refuge. They dove into it just as the next blast hit the snow behind them, spraying ice and shrapnel in all directions. The entrance to the tunnel was narrow, and the walls felt as though they were closing in on them. But it was their only hope. They crawled through the ice and metal, their bodies scraped by jagged edges, their breath sharp and ragged. Dan checked his tracker low on power, the signal weak. But they were close. Just a little further, and they would be safe, hidden from the machine's pursuit. But as they crawled deeper into the tunnel, the ground shook again, this time not from the Auto-Guardian's footsteps. No, this was something worse. Sila, whispering in panic. "What's happening?" Dan's eyes went wide with realization as the walls of the tunnel trembled, and a deep rumble echoed through the frozen passage. The Auto-Guardian had found them, and it was bringing its full force to bear. "Dan," his voice grim, but steady. "They are not going to let us go that easily." The air was still, too still. The deafening roar of the storm outside had faded into an eerie silence. Dan and Sila sat in the darkness of the narrow mining tunnel, their breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of what they had just escaped pressing heavily on them. Their bodies were bruised and scraped, the sharp metal edges of the tunnel leaving marks on their skin. But neither of them made a sound, the only noise coming from the faint hum of the tracker Dan had managed to keep alive. It flickered weakly in his hands, but it was enough. They were getting close. Dan glanced at Sila, her face pale but resolute. She had been running for so long, her life nothing but a series of escapes. But here, in the cold, silent tunnel, it seemed like everything had come to a head. The moment when she had to decide not just to survive, but to live. Dan, his voice soft but filled with gravity. "We're almost there. Just a little farther." Sila didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just nodded, her eyes focused on the darkness ahead of them. She wasn't sure what awaited them on the other side, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. "Sila," whispering, her voice filled with resolve. "What happens after we reach the beacon?" Dan paused, his hand on the wall as he moved forward. His eyes flickered to the tracker again, the signal almost overwhelming in its quiet urgency. Dan, glancing at her, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm not sure. The beacon might bring us help, or it might just bring more trouble. But at least, we'll have options." Sila walked beside him, her movements slow but determined. They were both tired, each step a challenge, but there was no turning back. Not now. Sila, her voice quiet, reflective. You know, I never imagined I'd get this far. Running, hiding, never knowing where I'm going. But now I have a chance. A real chance. Dan's eyes softened, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He hadn't expected this to happen. Hadn't expected to be here, in this moment, standing beside someone who wasn't just another survivor, but someone who might actually want to fight. Someone who had a choice. Dan, with a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You have a chance because you took it. You didn't just wait for someone to save you. Sila stopped for a moment, her fingers brushing the wall of the tunnel as if feeling the pulse of the planet itself. She glanced at Dan, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. Just an understanding. They had both chosen this. Chosen to face whatever came next, together. Sila, smiling faintly, almost to herself. Funny. I always thought that, in the end, I'd be alone. That was the only thing I could count on. Dan's expression softened, his hand reaching out to steady her. She was trembling, though it wasn't from the cold. Dan, gently. You're not alone anymore. You've got me. And I've got you. They continued moving, the light at the end of the tunnel growing closer with each step. But just as they reached the mouth of the tunnel, the ground beneath them rumbled again, the sound of heavy steps vibrating through the earth. This wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. Sila's breath caught in her throat. Sila, whispering, panic creeping into her voice. They found us. How are they? Dan, urgently, his eyes scanning the entrance ahead of them. They never stopped looking. Stay close. A shadow loomed at the end of the tunnel, too large to be human. It moved with purpose, its silhouette dark and menacing in a dim light. The Auto Guardian. The same machine that had hunted them before, now barreling toward them with terrifying precision. Sila froze, her hand gripping Dan's tightly. Her chest tightened, but there was no more running. Not anymore. Sila, her voice trembling with defiance. We don't have anywhere to go now. What do we do? Dan turned to her, his expression cold but determined. Dan, softly, firmly. We stand. For a moment, everything stopped. The world outside the tunnel was silent, the wind forgotten, the storm ceased. It was just them now. The end of their journey had arrived. The Auto Guardian loomed closer, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. Sila, whispering, almost to herself. And if we die here? Dan didn't hesitate. He met her gaze, his eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of a promise. Dan, his voice steady, unwavering. Then we die together. But not before we make them remember us. The sound of the Auto Guardian's footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnel, each step vibrating through the walls like the ticking of a clock counting down to their final moment. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Dan stood at the mouth of the tunnel, his rifle ready, eyes fixed on the slowly advancing machine. The Auto Guardian's red eyes burned through the darkness, scanning for targets, its massive frame casting an ominous shadow across the snow. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with every movement it made. Sila stood beside him, her hand gripping her blaster tightly. She was ready. She had to be. But her hands were shaking not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led them here. She wasn't running anymore. They had nowhere to run. Dan, low, his voice steady but urgent. We don't have much time. Once it's within range, we take our shot. Disrupt its systems. We make it shut down, and then we run. Sila nodded, her eyes locked onto the Auto Guardian, her expression hardening. This was it. The moment they had both been dreading, but also the moment they had been waiting for. A stand, together, against the force that had been hunting her, and now, hunting both of them. Sila, whispering, with determination. We do this, and we make them remember us. The Auto Guardian's steps grew louder, closer. Dan could feel the tension in the air, his heartbeat thumping in his chest. This was no longer about survival. This was about fighting for something more, fighting for a chance to live freely, to stand together against a system that had tried to destroy them both. Dan, grimly, but with resolve. Don't hesitate. We get one shot. Sila took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her eyes flicked to the sky outside the tunnel, to the swirling storm, and then back to Dan. The storm didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered but this. She had made her choice. And now, it was time to stand. The Auto Guardian stopped at the entrance of the tunnel, its massive frame filling the doorway, blocking out what little light there was left. The machine's sensors hummed, glowing brighter, and Dan could feel its gaze on them, calculating. Sila, whispering, as the machine moved closer. It's too close. Dan took a step forward, his finger brushing the trigger of his rifle. He knew the moment was coming, the moment when they would either win or lose everything. The machine's red eyes glowed even brighter, its massive hand reaching out as if to crush them both in one swift motion. Dan, shouting, breaking the silence. Now. The blast rang out, the sound deafening in a narrow tunnel. Dan fired first, a shot aimed directly at the Auto Guardian's core, hitting its outer armor. The machine staggered back, its systems briefly glitching as sparks flew from the wound. But it wasn't enough. The machine still moved, its targeting systems locking onto them with deadly precision. Sila fired next, her blaster's beam hitting the Auto Guardian's control panel. There was an explosion of sparks, followed by a series of mechanical whirring noises as the machine's systems began to fail. Sila, yelling, her voice shaking with the force of the attack, Come on, shut down already. For a moment, it seemed like the machine might finally give way. But then, the Auto Guardian's eyes flared even brighter, its arm swinging towards them in a deadly arc. Dan ducked, pulling Sila out of the way just in time as the massive metal limb crashed into the ground where they had been standing. Dan, his voice urgent, pushing Sila towards the tunnel's exit. Move. Move now. Sila stumbled, but Dan caught her, urging her forward. The machine was still functional, but its movements were sluggish, its systems failing. The moment they had bought with their attack was slipping away. They ran, faster now, their bodies moving as one, pushing through the snow and ice toward the distant beacon. The Auto Guardian's steps were slower, its frame jerking with every movement, but it was still coming. Still hunting. Sila's heart pounded in her chest as they neared the beacon, the signal light blinking weakly in the distance. They were almost there. Almost free. But the ground beneath them began to shake again, and Sila realized with a sickening lurch that the Auto Guardian wasn't the only threat they had to face. A faint, echoing sound cut through the howling storm. The roar of engines. Dan, with a sinking feeling, looking back at Sila. They've called in the reinforcements. The sounds of the Royal Hunter's ships grew louder, closing in on them. They were not alone. The entire force was coming for them now. And the beacon? It might bring them help, or it might just attract more enemies. Sila, panting, but determined. They won't stop. Not until they have me. Dan glanced over at her, his expression hardening. Dan, gripping her hand tightly, his voice low but resolute. Then we keep running. But this time, we're running for a reason. Sila met his gaze, the connection between them stronger than ever. They had come this far, against all odds. And now, they were no longer running just to survive. They were running to live. To stand together and fight for their freedom, no matter the cost. The wind howled with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Snow whipped through the air, stinging their skin as Dan and Sila ran, pushing their exhausted bodies forward. The beacon was now just a few hundred yards ahead, barely visible through the storm, but it was there, flickering like a distant hope in the white haze of the icy wilderness. Behind them, the unmistakable roar of engines drew closer. The Royal Hunters weren't just following them anymore, they were closing in fast. More ships, more machines, more soldiers. It was a wave of destruction that would wipe them off the map if they didn't act soon. Dan, his voice breathless, but determined. We're almost there. We just need to make it to the ridge. Then we can activate the signal. But we have to be quick. Sila's hand gripped his tightly as they moved, her breath ragged in the freezing air. She was exhausted, every step feeling like it was pulling her deeper into the storm, deeper into the hopelessness that had defined her life for so long. But now she wasn't running from fear. She was running towards something that felt more like freedom than survival. Dan, glancing over at her, his voice low and urgent. "Stay with me, Sila. We're doing this together." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. They had come so far, and yet she knew the enemy was still behind them, still ready to strike. But this time, they had a plan. This time, they weren't just waiting for the inevitable. This time, they were going to make their stand. Ahead of them, the ridge loomed, a jagged line against the swirling white backdrop of the storm. It was just a few more steps, just a few more. Sila, her voice shaking, but resolute. "Dan, what if we don't make it?" Dan's eyes softened as he looked at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had seen that question in her eyes for so long, the fear of never having a choice, never having the chance to truly live. But now, that fear had shifted, replaced with something stronger. "Dan," his voice firm, full of conviction. "Then we make it count. We make sure they remember us." They reached the ridge, and Dan immediately set to work, pulling the small encrypted device from his pack. The wind howled around them, threatening to tear the beacon from his hands, but Dan didn't falter. He knew what had to be done. Sila, looking back, her heart racing as the sound of engines grew louder. "They are almost here." Dan's hands worked quickly, activating the beacon and sending the encrypted signal out into the cold, dark space. The small device hummed softly as it transmitted, but they didn't have time to wait for a response. They needed to act now. Dan, looking over his shoulder, his voice filled with finality. "Get ready. We move now, or we don't move at all." Sila nodded, her body moving into position beside him. They had no more time to waste. The moment the signal went out, they had to be ready to run, ready to face whatever came next. And then, as if on cue, the first of the Royal Hunter ships broke through the storm's veil, its shadow falling over them like a death sentence. The machines, the soldiers, they were here. They had found them. Dan, eyes narrowed, determination burning in his chest. "This is it." Sila stepped closer to him, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "Sila, we're not running anymore. Whatever happens next, we face it together." The hunters landed, their figures towering in the distance as they marched toward the ridge. But Dan didn't move. He didn't flinch. For the first time, he wasn't just standing there waiting for the end. He was standing, choosing to face it. And Sila was right beside him. Dan, to Sila, with fierce resolve. "Let them come." The first blast of energy came from the ship, the beam slicing through the air with a deafening crack. Dan raised his rifle and fired back, not with the hope of winning but with the knowledge that, for the first time, he was fighting for something worth dying for. As the blasts of energy filled the air around them, the ground beneath them cracked, and the storm seemed to intensify. But neither Dan nor Sila moved. They stood their ground. And then, just as the hunters closed in, something unexpected happened. The beacon, a small, blinking light in the chaos, began to glow brighter. A signal was returned. The transmission was received. The ships overhead began to shift, the signal reaching the royal command, and for the first time, the hunters hesitated. The soldiers looked to their commanders, confused, unsure. Something had changed. Something was happening that they didn't expect. Dan, with a glimmer of hope in his voice. "They are hearing us." The ground shook again, but this time, it wasn't from the machines. It was from them, the resistance, the people who had been waiting, the ones who had received the message. A voice came over the COMM system, distant but unmistakable. Voice, crackling over the intercom. "Attention, Royal Command. This is not a pursuit. This is a warning. Release the prisoners or face the consequences." The hunters hesitated. The machines stopped moving. It wasn't just Dan and Sila anymore. The galaxy had heard their message. The galaxy had remembered them. And for the first time, Dan felt something he had not felt in years: hope. In a world torn apart by power and brutal systems, Dan and Sila's story is not just one of escape, but a journey of standing up against fate. Two strangers from different worlds chose to live together in a world full of danger and injustice. They didn't just run, they fought, stood firm against enemies, faced life and death decisions, and ultimately found freedom in their sacrifice and trust in each other. But this story isn't over. The threat still looms, and the world they are trying to change will never forget those who chose to stand up. Their footsteps will continue to echo in this vast universe. Dan and Sila have chosen each other, and they will keep fighting, not just to survive, but to make the world remember their names. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a comment about what you think, and what challenges you think Dan and Sila will face next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more thrilling stories and new adventures. Thank you for watching, and remember, life is not just about running away, but standing up and fighting.